Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello.
How are you doing?
We're doing fine, as well as can be expected. You know,
As well
strange
as can
times.
it's as well as can be expected. Seems to be the common response for most people in these trying times. So you and I have a common love, a common interest, a common passion, a common bugbear, and it's called plain language. And mine stems from my background in communication, where the best way I can describe it is one of my team members that told me to just always speak human to humans. Just speak in language that people can understand, can relate to from a communication perspective to make your communication more persuasive and influential. I've always, however, wondered, and that's why I love so much that you and I can have this conversation, can this plain language thing, this speak human to humans, really translate into legal and risk management and compliance and policies and procedures, all of the traditional regulatory frameworks? Does speaking human to humans apply in the areas you work in?
I think for me, the most important thing to remember is, even, let's say I'm writing a contract and the contracting parties are two companies, right? The company can't read. It's not a thing. It's artificial. Nor can a company actually care about anything, which is some of the problems that I often have with internal communications. But it's always a person reading. And that person, even though they're reading by virtue of the fact that they are employed by an organization, they come with the same flaws as all humans do that stand in the way of understanding communications. And the more important part of it is in addition to having the same sort of things that they have to get over, in order to understand communication, they have to do something. It's always the human that has to do something, even if that something comes from a contract, a policy, from a compliance framework. It doesn't matter. You're talking to people always. And so you have to recognize that, and then all of a sudden accepting the fact that communicating clearly is important, even in legal communication, becomes a little bit easier to stomach, I think, for most people.
It is, however, a different habit for the legal fraternity to adopt, right? I remember early in my career, I've had to learn, as I call it, legalese, to delve through pages and pages and paragraphs to just get to the point of what are they actually trying to say and what am I signing for? Yeah. Do you think the onus is on those working in companies to know legalese without becoming legal experts, or do you think the onus is on those creators of the documents of enterprise risk frameworks and compliance frameworks, etc.? Who is the onus on? Where's the responsibility for creating this understandable language?
I think it's incredibly easy and sometimes incredibly tempting to place the blame for not understanding something on the reader. And that is hardly ever justified, right? So often when people misunderstand what we say, well, they're stupid, or they can't understand these difficult concepts, etc. But the reality is that if you look at how communication happens, right, you have a person who speaks, sometimes you have a text in the middle, and then you have the person who has to understand. It is the responsibility of the person sending the message to make sure that the message is clear, always. So I think that it's often a cop-out to say, well, it's on you to make sure that you understand. And if you don't understand, you must ask. No, actually. I mean, I feel like this every time I see a FAQ, right? A frequently asked questions document. We did a project not too long ago for a financial services provider to simplify their forms. And one of the first things that we saw that was a danger sign to us is there were 12 different FAQs around this form. And my first response to that client was, well, if you find yourself frequently answering the same question, it means that there's something wrong with the form, not that there's something wrong with the person using the form, if they're all having that experience.
And what was their response?
Well, so how do we sell these projects is sort of the hidden question, isn't it? One of the things that's incredibly powerful for us, and I think that sets us apart from other legal service providers, is we do a lot of testing, right? So we behave a little bit more like people who are in UX, right? So user experience. And we do usability testing on all of our documents. And the only thing that I had to say to the board of directors of that particular company is we did a test using 60 people who fall in the demographic of your market. We gave them financial advisors. We gave them all of the support that they would normally have. out of 60, only 3 could fill in the form correctly enough for a transaction to take place. I then asked them for their call center data and showed them that 80% of the call center's time was being spent following up on poorly filled in forms. And then went, well, that means 80% of your operational cost of the call center is being caused by a bad form. Fix the form.
Fix the form. And it's
fix the form.
Yeah, fix the form. It's as simple as that. But when I work with businesses and I advise and sit in these strat sessions and facilitate it, I always, the first 4 hours almost is breaking through this barrier of jargon and business and what we used to and how we frame things, and me just asking the questions, the what now, the what now, the what now, what is this, what does that stand for, why is this relevant, and getting to a point where we can talk in language that speaks about, don't worry, that speaks about concepts that everybody understands, not concepts that makes me feel clever, or that serves ego, or that's hides incompetence, that is only suitable to a certain level in an organization. And it's incredibly important what you said just now. It's not just about the language bit, it's not just about being understandable, but it's got an actual direct impact to your return of operations or your return on investment. Redesign the form, fix the form, fix the language. It's not just marketing fluff. It actually has an impact throughout the business. What then,
exactly.
If you look at a form, or if you look at and you've got a specific way of setting up contracts, so maybe you can talk about that as well. What you look at right at the start, if you approach it from a plain language point of view, is it just as simple as editing out the jargon? Or is there a different way of looking at everything that surrounds it?
Yeah, so drafting something in plain language isn't an editing exercise or a translation exercise. So, we always say we work on, it's almost like a upside down triangle, right? So we first look at the macro, what we call the macro level. At the macro level, I'm going to throw away the document. I'm not going to look at it. I look at it obviously when I analyze it at the beginning of a project. Now I'm going to ask you questions like, okay, who are we speaking to? Right? So let's say it's a consumer or it's a client-facing document. I'm going to ask you, who is your client? I'm going to ask you how old they are on average. I'm going to ask you how experienced they are.
Yeah, there's a big difference in asking who is your client, how old are they, and asking who are your stakeholder groupings and what demographic are we targeting. Once again, if you ask the questions in this language, you'll get the answers in a language that is not plain language. Okay, so you start asking the questions, who's the customer? Who's this for?
Who's reading this document, or who's hearing this video, or who's the call center talking to? So I just as often do call center scripts as I do written documents or do videos, or it doesn't matter what channel you're using to communicate. Who are you speaking to? What do you want them to either do, feel, understand? And that feeling bit is very important. So we're in the middle of a crisis, right? So at the moment, a large part of my team is doing crisis communications, right? So what do I know about people in a crisis, readers in a crisis? So you might find interesting. So we do a lot of cognitive science plays a large role in what we do. One of the things that you need to understand about people when they are in what they call a hot state, right? So panicky, they are scared, they're under pressure. And all of these things are currently true. So what happens is it triggers the flight or fight response in your body, which means that the blood flows from your brain to your muscles. There's absolutely nothing that you can do about it. If you are a seasoned meditator, you can limit the effect. And what that does, and these are studies from like the 70s, what that does is you lose up to 25 IQ points, right? So literally the people who you are talking to at the moment do not have a diminished capacity to understand complicated things.
Not because they are stupid, but because physiologically they are unable to decide in the way they would have been able to decide 2 months ago.
They're stressed, right? So if you want them to do something, if you want them to feel something other than panic, you have to break it down even more. But that's what I mean with getting to know who you are talking to. It's not only who are they from a demographic point of view, but where are they? while they're reading. They have children running around them, right? It's very likely that my children are going to make an appearance on this podcast.
They will be welcome.
I apologize. We are all BBC dad now.
We are all BBC dad now. All of us.
Exactly. So where are they when they're reading your document or hearing your message? What are the circumstances? What are the things that are innately human about them? So this thing about being stupider when you're panicking. And then more specific things like, okay, what do we want to communicate by this document? And then you have to pick. You can't, and this is the thing about lawyers. We want to say everything. That's how we're trained. We're
and not just lawyers,
right?
Not just lawyers, from a marketing and a communication point of view as well.
Yeah.
I always have to go, what should they do? No, we want to tell them this. It's not the point. What do you want them to do? But we want to tell them this. It's not the point. What do you want them to do? And changing the mindset around what is everything we can tell them. And I always say, information does not equal influence. No. Just dumping information does not help. Yeah. So the question is then not what you want to say.
Actually.
Yeah. Question is not what you want to say, but what you want these people to do. Yes. And then the next step.
I would teach, and this is very difficult for lawyers because lawyers, we want to be precise, and we believe very firmly that precision is volume, right? So precision is saying everything, catering for every eventuality, right? And to those lawyers, I always say, well, okay, let's sketch a scenario, the scenario where a person, just by looking at your document, decides not to read it, right? So people often make this decision. I see a 60-page document. I'm going to go, okay, it goes to the bottom of my list. I'm literally not going to read it. Yeah. Or you have a document that isn't 60 pages long, so you've decreased the amount of information, but you've presented it in a very appealing way so that at least the 80% of the document that is truly important, the message is transmitted. Surely that is a better outcome than 100% of it not being transmitted, right? So communication is making difficult choices quite often, and it is your responsibility to make sure you're not overloading people with information that, whilst true and while strictly speaking relevant, isn't important, right? So you can also, as you know, I mean, you can also layer information, right? Yeah. You don't just have to give people everything and pretend like everything's equally important, because it hardly ever is. So you can also layer information. So go, okay, well, these are the 5 things that I want everybody to read. And then you have your discerning or more inquiring reader that might want to read more. So then you have a read more, and they can click through, or they can page on, you know, if it's a physical document. So it's all techniques like that, but it's all driven by asking the question, who are you talking to? And what do you want to say? What do you want to say?
Surely then that opens the organization up to risk. So from a comms point of view, easy to do. I've been doing it for ages. We work in exactly the same way. But since my background isn't legal or risk management and yours is, can you get away with it? Can you just exclude stuff? Isn't there a law against excluding stuff?
Yeah, yes and no. So I am in risk management, as you point out. And so what risk management means is triage, right? Not all risks are equal. Always, the analogy that I use is we all have that one annoying colleague or client that marks every email urgent, right? So what happens when you emphasize everything is that actually nothing is emphasized.
Yeah.
Okay. So not necessarily about leaving things out, although we find that the documents that we work with, roughly 30% of the content is in there for no reason. In fact, the company doesn't even know that it's in there. It's just in there because it's been there for 20 years. So firstly, there's just the stuff that you can cut because it's either a repetition or it's irrelevant or we've never relied on it ever before. So then my question to you is, by leaving it out, let's say this type of contract has been in use for 20 years at your company. If I say, well, this clause, have you ever relied on it? No, I didn't even know it was there. What is the risk of leaving it out? The test that I use is very simple. Well, the first time you get a draft back from me, I'm going to leave out the stuff that I think was in there just because. And if you don't pick up that I've left it out, it means there's almost no risk. And I'm okay with 5% risk or 10% risk because I'm a risk manager. So I know risks are relative.
Yeah.
It's more important to me that I communicate the truly important information. If I then leave out something that is so unimportant that you don't even notice it when it's gone, I'm okay with that. So yes, it does. We're a bit fearless, but we're also cautious. Obviously, obviously,
maybe,
you know,
yeah.
we don't break laws.
No, and that's what I'm trying to get to. So there is a new way to do this thing, and as we are, you know, moving towards a recovery period, not post lockdown, but post crisis. So
Yeah.
in a few months' time, you know, hopefully as soon as
The
possible,
new
but not
world,
in the
yes.
short term. When we get
Mm.
there, and when we have to create new things with new understanding, and a lot of what I'm hearing as I speak to experts in the field and other speakers and so on, it's what I'm seeing is the trend is going to focus a lot on essentials and on meaning and on humans and on community, taking people into account. So there's going to have to be a change in how we communicate, not just from a marketing comms point of view, but from a, you know, how we tie people into relationships, into formal relationships with our companies, with our organizations. So we do have this gap for creating something new without breaking the laws. How did you find your experience coming from, because what's your qualification? You are qualified as a...
I'm a lawyer.
You're a lawyer.
I'm a lawyer. I'm a proper lawyer. Yeah.
What is your experience?
Former Web Eventual lawyer.
Proper. So what was your journey as proper lawyer to, well, we can't say it's an improper lawyer, but to understanding that it's about more than just dumping information and covering all your bases? What was
my
that
backstory?
Like?
My backstory, or like a superhero, my origin story.
Yes.
So I come from an interesting background. In part, all of this is genetic. So my father, who is a retired professor, started the first unit for document design, which was at the University of Stellenbosch a number of years ago. The story about that illustrates what it was like in my house is the day we were watching 9/11. We were watching the towers come down, and my father, I'll never forget it, my father said, "Look at all the paper in the air. Look at all the documents." And so that notion of information design and document design and business communication was something that I grew up with. And then I went to study law, in part because I love language. I really do. And law is a language. And so a lot of people who are ironically, who are linguists at heart go and study law. And then something funny happens, right? So my first day, and this is the same for all law firms, my first day, my principal, the senior partner who's responsible for my education, asks me to write a letter. It's a very simple letter. We got a letter from a lawyer, and all I have to say is that we received your letter, and we will respond as soon as we have the information that we need.
Yeah, easy peasy, simple.
That letter went through 16 drafts and ended up something like the following. We refer to your letter dated 25 January. We will revert in due course as soon as we have received instructions from our client. I didn't understand what that meant, right? And so I went with it, because that's why we always say legalese is hereditary, right? It gets drummed into you as a young lawyer. And
that's how we do things. We don't question it because that's how it's done.
But it didn't sit well with me, because well, the first thing that didn't sit well with me is that's the incorrect use of the word revert.
I will never use the word revert again, ever.
No, you can't revert to me. That means you're changing into me. Anyway, never mind. That's a story for another day.
Linguist.
So that didn't sit comfortably with me. And then in about 2008, a piece of legislation got passed in South Africa called the Consumer Protection Act. And in it had this almost revolutionary clause, which stated that all consumer-facing contracts must be in plain language. And it gave a very good definition of plain language, which it got from, ironically, of course, the definition of plain language isn't itself in plain language. And at the time, I was very interested in contract law, and I was the only person at the firm who had read the Consumer Protection Act, that had published a little bit about it. It had a section in it on unfair contract terms, and I was interested because I was an insurance lawyer. And all of a sudden, I became the expert in consumer law. And a large part of that, what it meant in 2008, was everybody is stressing out about, what does this mean? We must communicate in plain language. how do I communicate policy wording in plain language? Policy wording is the thing that happens when you lock a lawyer and an actuary in a room, right? So not even insurance companies understand their own policy wording. So that's how it started for me. But in a sense, it was something that I feel that I was almost destined to do. And so now I surround myself not with other lawyers, but with information designers. So my business partners, only one of them is a lawyer, and she's also not a normal lawyer. The rest are change managers, communication specialists, information designers. So it's I think it's an idea that time has come. I mean, it comes from about the 1970s, and there's a well-established movement towards plain language in legal services, and that is gaining momentum. Customers or clients these days are incredibly unforgiving if you give them advice that they don't understand, and you do that at 7,000 Rand an hour. As far as I'm concerned, if you do that, you haven't done your job yet. So
what is the pushback then? Because surely this wasn't a smooth journey from you going to, reverting all over the place and telling clients that this is not the way. Surely even now, today, even with this movement, even with a whole bunch of advice to the contrary of traditional legalese, surely you still get pushback where people say, well, this doesn't look familiar, this doesn't seem formal enough.
I'm uncomfortable.
I'm uncomfortable. What usually happens in those situations do you find that 50-50 go with your advice and just take a chance and go, hang on, this is not too bad, and the other 50 just revert back to the old way of doing things?
That's why my one business partner is a change manager that specializes in governance, risk, and compliance. So what is interesting is that we will more often than not get briefed by a compliance officer. Often in financial services where there's also a plain language obligation, so they see it as part of the compliance function to ensure that there's proper communication. The other thing that has started happening recently is that auditors are starting to audit for plain language. So we're getting adverse audit findings. Yes. There's a big movement at the moment to create an ISO standard for plain language, which is because auditors are auditing for plain language. So,
but ISO isn't plain language by any means.
No. So it's again, the ironies abound. I do get a lot of pushback, particularly from my learned colleagues, and there are a couple of strategies that I employ in order to get them on board. Some of them are kinder than others. Depends on. But usually you can appeal to their rationality because the data is very clear, right, about the benefits of plain language. We just show them the data. We take an incredibly research-driven approach to these things. And say, well, this document, we can show you how it tested. No one understands it. What is the legal risk to someone not understanding a contract? Well, it's litigation. Costs money.
Yeah. And not a little bit. You've got to have an appetite for litigation if you want to enter into it. It's not something to take lightly.
Most court cases are misunderstandings.
And that's very important to note. Most court cases are misunderstandings. Most complaints on social media at that small degree are misunderstandings. Most everything is misunderstandings.
Trace it back to it's a misunderstanding. I said something and you heard something else. So if we can cut that down, you cut down on conflict. All of a sudden, you're saving all kinds of lawyers' fees. The most mean tactic I once used was a lawyer who wouldn't listen to me and insisted on still writing in Latin. It took me 4 hours, but I wrote my next email to him in Latin, to which he responded, I don't speak Latin, to which I said, well, why do you write Latin then?
Yes. I took a year of Latin in high school. I gave up after a year and switched to French. That was a little bit easier, but Latin, I couldn't. For the life of me, I could not figure out Latin.
Yeah. And then there's obviously the socioeconomic arguments or the social arguments that you can use in South Africa. So, and we're seeing it now in the crisis. A crisis, one of the fortunate parts of a crisis is it brings out people's humanity, right? And I think that's what you were alluding to earlier, is that, we're seeing an emphasis on the humane. So except for lawyers, the lawyers seem to be a bit slow to realize this. So I see things like people are saying you must trigger the force majeure clause in your contract. By the time you do that relationship is gone. No one is paying anybody anything. No one's doing anything. It's an extremely aggressive move, right? Our advice instead is, to write write to this supplier, emphasize your relationship, emphasize that we are all in this together, emphasize that you want to sit down and find a solution that will suit both of you. And wonderful things happen. People make plans. People are creative, you know.
Yeah.
But if you antagonize them, creativity goes out the window. So your ability to solve a problem goes out the window. And that's what I think lawyers should be. We're problem solvers. Compliance officers, we're problem solvers. Risk managers, problem solvers. That's what we are. So,
for those watching this video, if you're in a position either from a risk management point of view or a compliance officer, or even a director on a board or a business owner, what should be your steps? What's the first piece of documentation in your organization usually you should look at in terms of plain language? I will obviously say, go to your website, go read through it aloud. If it doesn't sound like you, if it doesn't feel like you, there's something wrong with it, fix it as soon as you can. But what, from a legal point of view and a policy point of view, what are the first documents that anyone watching this video should have a look at?
It depends on whether you want to take a top-down or a bottom-up approach. So if your end goal is to create a culture of clarity and plain language and user-centric thinking, user being, whether the user is an employee or a client or whatever, I don't care. Supplier, they're all users of documents. So reader-oriented is perhaps a clearer way to describe it. If you want to establish a culture of that, you need to look at your internal documents first. Right, so get your own house in order. There's something incredibly disingenuous about businesses that wax lyrical about the fact that they have plain language customer-facing documents, but then they don't have plain language employee policies. Right, that seems a little bit disingenuous. So if you really want to live plain language and clarity and being reader-focused and human-centric as a value, you need to start from within. We do draft quite a few plain language policies, plain language style guides. You'll be familiar with the concept of a style guide. So even when we write contracts, this is how we sound, right? This is how we want to sound. And this is how it relates back to our values or our strategy or whatever you want to connect it to. The other way of thinking about it is to do your high impact documentation first. So that's a more risk-based approach. In other words, we say, well, we need to triage at first. So then I would say, your customer-facing documentation is probably most important. Followed very short on its heels, I would say, is your standard operating procedures or your procedures, right? So one of the most interesting articles I've read in the last decade was by The Atlantic, the newspaper, and it was about, there was an airline or a disaster a number of years ago. The company was called EasyJet. And it's very reminiscent of the Boeing debacle that's going on now. And they were writing about the role that unclear procedures, had in causing the disaster. There was a lack of clarity in the procedures, and when procedures are not sure, when you're not sure of what a procedure means, most people ignore it. That's human. Right? If there's ambiguity, if I stand in the middle of my kitchen and I say to my partner and my 2 children, by the time I get home, someone must clean the kitchen. No one's going to clean the kitchen.
No one's going to clean the kitchen.
Clearly assigned responsibility. And procedures are, I think, often overlooked. Policies can come later, but procedures, that's where we say, this is how we do things. If, for instance, you've written it in the passive voice, right, where we say, well, the kitchen must be cleaned.
It's the kitchen's problem. Right? That immediately becomes the kitchen's problem to figure out how it's going to clean
itself. It hides the doer.
Yeah.
Right. It hides the doer and it hides the verb. So no one knows what must be done. So those documents are very high risk. Like if you're in compliance and you look at your procedures and you suspect people are not understanding your procedures, how are you managing compliance with policies? You aren't. You're not. You're not managing it. Right. So those are the sort of important documents. Policies can come later. Strategies can come later. I often find strategies are completely gobbledygook. I mean,
absolutely. It's copy and paste from this and this and taking this into account and referring to something that doesn't exist and, creating abstract ideas and never... Yeah, and it never filters through to the practical. Who's going to do what, by when, and what are we going to do if it doesn't get done? disciplinary frameworks
Yeah,
and
exactly.
responsibility. Who's going to do what by when? And what are we going to do if it doesn't get done? And it might seem simplistic and it might seem overly simplified.
We refer to that as, yeah.
You refer to that as?
I was interrupting you. It's management consulting speak, right? There's a New York Times piece, they call it a deep dive to remember, where they're sending up management consultants and how they speak. And what happens when management consultants go on dates with each other? A deep dive to remember.
Oh,
no one understands it.
No one understands it. And that's why I'm so very passionate about doing what I do. And I simply call it doing better business better. It's very plain. It's very simple. It speaks to the topics of governance and ethics and compliance, and people and leadership and teams and all of these abstract high-level concepts that you study in an MBA. But for me, pretty much doing better business better is what we need to figure out right now in the simplest way possible.
Yes.
And that brings me to my last thought for this video, because I'm sure we'll be having a couple more. When it is, and I know your answer is going to be now, but when is the best time to start reviewing at least your customer-facing documentation and your standard operating procedures? Is now, when companies are in crisis mode, trying desperately to keep some of the doors open, is now the right time? Or should they wait until something recovers?
Look, it depends on what industry you're in and what situation your business is in. So, there are some industries that are in survival mode, which is completely justified. To them, I say, this morning I watched Simon Sinek, the guy responsible for Find Your Why. You're probably familiar with him. I watched his pep talk to his team. And he said something that is really sticking in my head today, and I'm sure for the many days to come, is at some point we need to get out of survival mode and into reinvention mode, right? So survival mode is important because we have to do some things immediately to shore up our cash flow so that we can buy ourselves the time so that we can start thinking about what it means to be our organization in this new post-COVID-19 world. Because I think there's consensus that things are not going to go back to the old way. Not entirely. No. And so the companies that are going to, in every crisis, there's always companies that go under and there are companies that thrive. And I think that the things that characterize the companies that thrive is what Simon Sinek would refer to as the infinite mindset, right? So not how do I get through this? How do I change to get through this, right? Yes. And one of the changes that I would urge business leaders to consider now is whether it isn't in this new world even more important than ever before that we communicate with compassion, that we communicate clearly, that we recognize it doesn't matter what type of document it is, there's always a human on the other side of it. That even in incredibly serious documents like commercial contracts, that we need to find our humanity and focus on relationships. And in order to do that, human-centric communication and reader-centric thinking is vital. It's interesting you mentioned ethics, and maybe this is my last thought for today, is there's a very, very close correlation between ethical organizations and organizations that embrace the principle of clarity. And I can't remember who said it. It wasn't me, unfortunately. Someone once said, you can't use plain language if you are saying the unthinkable. And what often happens in our projects is once I show you what your document says, because most of the times the people who created the document don't understand it either. They go, do we really say that? But we would never do that to an employee or to a customer or to a supplier. We would never do that. That is just unethical. And I go, okay, well, you have been saying it. So let's take that out maybe. So there's a very close correlation, I think, between ethical business, between being socially aware, etc., and using plain language or adopting it as part of your ethos to use. Maybe it's appropriate that we end with a Greek word, given that we're talking about plain language. Could have been Latin. So yeah, I think it is important.
It is important. And that's why I started creating this video series now, while there's a little bit still of a lull before in South Africa, the major crisis hits, if we look at the global trend line. So that for those that do have a space now, either in terms of time away from the regular busyness, or time in terms of there's enough cash flow to carry for a few months, that we can use what we have now, even though it might have dropped with 25 IQ points, that we can use what we have now to start redesigning our new, and to start redesigning it with clarity and with humanity.
Yes.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I look forward to our next chats.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Bye.
Cheers. All the best.